In this video, we're uncovering the haunting stories of every woman executed on death row in Texas, from the nature of their crimes to their final meals and the eerie last words they spoke before lethal injection. These women's stories are chilling, unforgettable, and deeply controversial. Whether they were viewed as cold-blooded killers or victims of circumstance, one thing is clear: their final moments reveal the raw truth of capital punishment in America's most active death penalty state. Before we dive into these disturbing stories, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We cover true crime cases that shock, intrigue, and challenge what we think we know about justice. Hit the bell icon so you never miss an upload. Carla Fay Tucker. In the early hours of June 13, 1983, Houston police were called to a gruesome double murder at a local apartment. Inside, they found the lifeless bodies of Jerry Lynn Dean and Deborah Thornton. Both had been brutally attacked, beaten and hacked to death with a pickaxe. The apartment was soaked in blood, and the savagery of the scene sent shockwaves through the community. At the center of this crime was 23-year-old Carla Fay Tucker, a heavy drug user who had spiraled deep into a life of addiction, violence, and chaos. Alongside her accomplice and then boyfriend Danny Garrett, Tucker had broken into the apartment with the intent to steal a motorcycle. But what began as a burglary quickly turned into something far more sinister. When Jerry Dean woke up and tried to resist, Tucker struck him repeatedly with a pickaxe. Deborah Thornton, an innocent woman who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, was killed shortly after. What made the case even more shocking was Carla's own admission. In court, she chillingly stated that she had experienced a sort of orgasm during the act of murder, a quote that would follow her for years and paint her in a horrifying light in the eyes of the public. Tucker was swiftly convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death in 1984, but her story didn't end there. While sitting on death row in Texas, something changed. Carla Fay Tucker underwent a very public conversion to Christianity. She became a born-again Christian, expressing deep remorse for her actions and dedicating her life in prison to faith, ministry, and rehabilitation. Over the next decade and a half, her transformation gained national and even international attention. Evangelists, human rights groups, and even Pope John Paul II petitioned for her sentence to be commuted to life imprisonment. Despite the growing calls for mercy and a national media frenzy surrounding the first woman to face execution in Texas in over a century, the state stood firm. Then Governor George W. Bush declined to intervene, and her execution by lethal injection was scheduled for February 3, 1998. As her execution date approached, Carla Fay Tucker declined a special last meal, a right afforded to death row inmates in Texas. Instead, she chose to eat the standard prison dinner served to all inmates that evening. Her final tray included a garden salad, baked chicken, mashed potatoes with gravy, mixed vegetables, sliced peaches, iced tea. It was a simple, unceremonious meal, perhaps intentionally so, as she had made peace with her fate and was focused on her spiritual readiness more than any earthly comforts. Last words. On the night of her execution, Carla was strapped to the gurney in the death chamber at the Huntsville unit. Her demeanor was calm, composed. She looked toward the witnesses, her supporters, prison officials, and even relatives of her victims, and offered words that struck many as deeply human, even touching. She said, "I am going to be face to face with Jesus now. I love you all very much. I'll see you all when you get there." At 6:45 p.m., Carla Fay Tucker was pronounced dead by lethal injection. Her execution stirred emotions and conversations across the country. Some saw her as a manipulative killer trying to escape justice. Others believed she had truly changed and deserved mercy. Regardless of where one stands, Carla Fay Tucker remains one of the most talked about and debated executions in American criminal justice history, a chilling example of how one violent act can spark a lifetime of moral and spiritual reckoning. Frances Newton. Frances Elaine Newton's case is one of the most controversial executions in Texas history, not just because of the brutality of the crime, but because of the deep doubts that lingered even as she took her final breath. On April 7, 1987, authorities arrived at a Houston apartment to a horrifying scene. Inside, they discovered the bodies of Adrian Newton, Frances's husband, their 7-year-old son Alton, and 21-month-old daughter Farah. All three had been shot execution style with a .25 caliber pistol. The home showed no signs of forced entry, and the killings appeared methodical, cold, calculated, and close range. Just weeks before the murders, Frances Newton had taken out life insurance policies on all three victims, totaling $100,000. Investigators found this timing suspicious, especially since she named herself the sole beneficiary. They also discovered that Newton had placed a bag containing the murder weapon in an abandoned house nearby, one that allegedly matched a gun owned by a friend of hers. She was arrested shortly after and charged with capital murder. During the trial, prosecutors painted a picture of a woman motivated by greed, a mother who valued money more than the lives of her family. Newton consistently denied her involvement, claiming she had been framed. She maintained that her husband was involved in drugs and owed money, which may have made him a target. But despite the lack of eyewitnesses or forensic evidence directly tying her to the crime, the jury delivered a guilty verdict. Frances Newton was sentenced to death in 1988, and over the next 17 years, her case became a focal point for death penalty critics. Concerns were raised about ballistic evidence, questions surrounding the timeline, and the reliability of the gun match. Even members of the legal community and faith leaders began to call for a deeper investigation. Some argued that the weapon used in the murders might not have been adequately tested and that new scientific methods could potentially clear her name. But all appeals were denied. Despite a 30-day stay of execution in 2004, granted by then-Governor Rick Perry to allow for a brief review, the state ultimately chose to proceed. The execution was rescheduled for September 14, 2005. Last meal, Frances Newton's final meal was modest and traditional. Her request included fried chicken, green beans, a fresh garden salad with ranch dressing, a glass of sweet tea, and a single peach. Unlike many death row inmates who leave their trays untouched, Frances quietly ate her meal in her final hours, calm, composed, and reflective. Last words. As she was escorted into the death chamber at the Huntsville unit, Newton remained poised. Facing the gathered witnesses, her relatives, attorneys, and prison officials, she delivered her last words with clarity and grace. She said, "I just want to say I love you all, and I'll be waiting for you. I'm all right." At 6:17 p.m., Frances Newton was pronounced dead by lethal injection. She was the first black woman executed in Texas since the state resumed capital punishment in 1982, and only the third woman overall. Frances Newton's execution still echoes in conversations about justice, race, and the fallibility of the death penalty. To this day, many continue to ask, did Texas execute an innocent woman? Or was this simply a cold-blooded killer who cloaked herself in doubt? In the absence of absolute certainty, her story remains one of the most haunting and polarizing in Texas death row history. Lisa Coleman. The case of Lisa Ann Coleman is one that stirred the deepest kind of outrage and heartbreak, because at the center of it was a child who suffered unthinkable cruelty before his death. And though Coleman wasn't his biological mother, she became one of the first women in the U.S. to be executed for a crime involving child abuse and neglect to this extreme. The victim was Davante Williams, a 9-year-old boy who lived in a cramped Texas apartment with his mother, Marshella Williams, and her partner, Lisa Coleman. What unfolded behind those closed doors was a quiet horror that no one outside seemed to notice, until it was too late. On July 26, 2004, emergency responders arrived at the apartment after a 911 call reported that Davante was unresponsive. What they found shocked even seasoned medics. The boy's body was covered in bruises, scars, and fresh wounds. He weighed only 35 pounds, half the normal weight for a child his age. His arms were tied with shoelaces. His wrists bore deep ligature marks. He had been denied food, care, and the basic dignity every child deserves. An autopsy revealed that Davante had died from malnutrition, pneumonia, and neglect. But it wasn't just what killed him, it was how long it had gone on. Prosecutors described the home as a house of horrors. Davante had been systematically isolated, beaten, and starved to death over a prolonged period. Lisa Coleman was charged with capital murder, not simply because of the boy's death, but because the abuse was considered both deliberate and prolonged. Under Texas law, that elevated the charge to capital punishment. Her partner, Marcella Williams, Devontae's mother, accepted a plea deal and received a life sentence in exchange for testifying against Coleman. During trial, Lisa's defense argued that she didn't intend to kill the child, that she came from her own history of abuse and dysfunction, and that she was being unfairly blamed for the mother's failings. But jurors saw something else, a woman who had the power to stop the suffering and chose not to. In 2006, she was sentenced to death. Coleman spent 8 years on death row, during which time her legal team fought to reverse the sentence. They argued that the original evidence did not meet the threshold for capital murder, and that Devontae's death, while tragic, resulted from neglect, not premeditated murder. But the courts disagreed. The execution date was set for September 17, 2014, at the Huntsville unit in Texas. Last meal. When it came time for her final meal, Lisa Coleman did not request a special last meal, a choice more common than most would think. In Texas, inmates must request meals from available prison food. Extravagant meals are no longer permitted. Coleman simply ate what the rest of the general prison population was served that evening. The contents of that tray were not made public, but it reflected her quiet demeanor in the hours leading up to her death. Last words. Strapped to the gurney in the death chamber, Coleman turned her head toward the witnesses, among them family members of the victim and her own supporters, and offered her final statement. Her voice was calm, and her words, though brief, revealed a mixture of remorse and steadfast conviction. She said, "I'm not a killer. I've done wrong in my life, but I'm not a killer. I'm ready, Lord." At 6:24 p.m., Lisa Coleman was pronounced dead by lethal injection. She was the 9th woman executed in Texas since the Civil War era, and her case remains one of the most disturbing examples of systemic child abuse to ever make it to the state's death row docket. Her execution reignited national debates about the death penalty for women, the role of systemic poverty and trauma in shaping abusers, and the line between neglect and murder. For many, Lisa Coleman was a monster. For others, she was a product of the same cycle of abuse that took young Devontae's life. But regardless of perspective, her final words still echo, "I'm not a killer." The story of Suzanne Margaret Basso is one that haunts even the most hardened detectives. Cold-hearted, manipulative, and disturbingly brutal, Basso wasn't just a participant in a crime. She was the one who orchestrated it from the shadows, directing others like pieces on a board, all for one horrifying goal: to gain control of a mentally disabled man's benefits. The victim was Louis "Buddy" Musso, a 59-year-old man with an intellectual disability who had the mind of a child and the heart of someone who just wanted companionship. He met Suzanne Basso through a church group in New Jersey, and in 1997, she convinced him to move to Texas to be with her, promising love, stability, and a new start. What Buddy didn't know was that Suzanne Basso had no intention of building a life with him. Instead, she was plotting behind closed doors to make him the target of a deadly scam. Shortly after he arrived in Texas, Basso applied to become the beneficiary of his life insurance and government checks. Then came the torture. Over the course of several days in a house shared with her adult son and other accomplices, Buddy was beaten, burned, forced to sit in bleach, and struck repeatedly with blunt objects. By the end, his body was covered in bruises and lacerations, many of which were consistent with abuse using belts, fists, and even tools. When his body was dumped near a roadside in Harris County, the autopsy revealed over 250 injuries. Prosecutors called it one of the most savage killings they'd seen. It wasn't just murder, it was ritualistic cruelty. Suzanne never laid a hand on Buddy herself, but she was the ringleader. She planned it. She manipulated others to do her bidding, and in the end, she stood to collect the money. In 1999, she was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. Her son, James O'Malley, and other co-defendants received life sentences. Basso, however, was the one prosecutors said truly pulled the strings. When Suzanne Basso's execution date approached in February 2014, she declined to request a special last meal. As per Texas Department of Criminal Justice policy, When no special meal is chosen, the inmate receives the standard prison dinner served to all that day. There are no public records detailing the exact contents of her final tray, but it was nothing extravagant, just a reflection of routine behind prison walls. Some believe Basso declined a last meal out of defiance. Others think she was trying to remain composed, in control until the very end. Last words. In the execution chamber at the Huntsville unit, Suzanne Basso appeared frail and quiet. She had been in poor health for years, suffering from various medical conditions. But as she lay strapped to the gurney, she spoke clearly, offering what seemed like a mix of resignation, religious conviction, and final peace. Her last words were, "In the name of Jesus, I am ready to go. I hold no grudges. I love you all. I hope my death gives you peace." At 6:26 p.m., Suzanne Basso was pronounced dead by lethal injection. She became the 14th woman executed in the United States since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976, and only the 5th woman executed in Texas since the Civil War era. Her execution sparked conversations about female perpetrators of orchestrated violence, the death penalty for those who direct rather than physically commit murder, and whether someone like Basso, plagued by illness and delusion, was even competent to be executed. What remains undisputed is the suffering inflicted on Buddy Musso, a vulnerable man who trusted her and paid with his life. Betty Lou Beets. Born in 1937 in North Carolina, Betty Lou had a troubled childhood. She lost her hearing due to a bout of measles at a young age and endured abuse at the hands of her father. By her mid-teens, she had entered into the first of what would become 5 tumultuous marriages, all of which were plagued by physical and emotional violence. But in the end, it was her 5th husband, Jimmy Don Beets, whose disappearance would reveal the darkest chapter of her life. In August 1983, Jimmy Don vanished without a trace. Betty Lou reported him missing, claiming he had gone out on his fishing boat and never returned. A search ensued, but no body was found, and no foul play was immediately suspected. The case went cold. It wasn't until 2 years later, when Betty Lou's son confessed to police that he had helped his mother hide Jimmy Don's body, that the full story came to light. Authorities returned to Betty Lou's property in Henderson County, Texas, and there, beneath a flower bed near the trailer home, they found the remains of Jimmy Don Beets. That alone was shocking. But what investigators found next was even more disturbing. The skeletal remains of another husband, Ronnie Threlkeld, buried in a garage storage shed on the same property. 2 men, 2 murders, 2 graves disguised beneath everyday surroundings. During the investigation and trial, prosecutors painted Betty Lou as a cold, calculated killer, someone who lured vulnerable men into her life, then disposed of them when they became inconvenient. They argued that her motive was financial, as she stood to benefit from her husband's life insurance policies and pensions. But supporters of Beets told a different story. They described her as a survivor of years of domestic violence, who had been beaten, raped, and terrorized by multiple men. They claimed that her crimes were not acts of cold-blooded evil, but of a woman pushed past her breaking point, a theory the courts ultimately rejected. In 1985, Betty Lou Beets was convicted of capital murder for the killing of Jimmy Don Beets. Though charges were never filed in Ronnie Threlkeld's death, the second body only deepened the case against her. For the next 15 years, she sat on death row, appealing her sentence and gathering public support from domestic violence advocates, anti-death penalty groups, and even international organizations. Despite this, her execution was scheduled for February 24, 2000, at the Huntsville unit in Texas. Last meal. For her final meal, Betty Lou Beets chose a Tex-Mex favorite, reflecting the comfort foods of her Southern upbringing. Her request included beef fajitas, refried beans, warm tortillas, a cup of coffee, and peach cobbler for dessert. It was a familiar, almost nostalgic meal, simple, flavorful, and served just hours before she would take her final walk. Last words. Strapped to the gurney in the death chamber, 62-year-old Betty Lou Beets looked calm as she addressed the witnesses. Her voice was soft but clear as she offered parting words filled with both peace and love. She said, "I have to go now. I love you. I'll see you on the other side." At 6:18 p.m., she was pronounced dead by lethal injection. becoming the second woman executed in Texas since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976 and the first woman executed in the U.S. in the 21st century. The case of Melissa Lucio is unlike any other on this list, not because of a confirmed execution, but because of how close she came to dying and how fiercely the world reacted in her defense. Her story exposes the uncertainties, flaws, and haunting gray areas of the American justice system, particularly in death penalty cases involving mothers. In 2008, Lucio, a mother of 14 from Harlingen, Texas, was convicted of capital murder in the death of her 2-year-old daughter, Mariah. The little girl was found unresponsive in the family's apartment with bruises covering her tiny body. Authorities said the signs pointed to long-term physical abuse, and during a 5-hour interrogation, exhausted, grieving, and overwhelmed, Lucio eventually said, "I guess I did it." Those 5 words would seal her fate. But from the beginning, Lucio insisted she was innocent. She claimed Mariah's death was the result of a tragic fall down a steep staircase, not abuse. Her defense argued that the child had a history of medical issues, including a blood clotting disorder, which could have caused her to bruise more easily. But prosecutors maintained that the pattern of injuries, including bite marks and head trauma, was consistent with systematic abuse, and they painted Lucio as a cruel and violent mother. After a brief trial with no forensic experts called in her defense, Melissa Lucio was convicted and sentenced to death in 2008, becoming the first Hispanic woman ever sentenced to death in Texas. Rising public outcry. For years, her case sat quietly on death row, until 2022 when it exploded into national consciousness. As her execution date of April 27, 2022 approached, a massive coalition of supporters emerged. From Kim Kardashian to Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, faith leaders, lawmakers from both political parties, and even members of the original jury, many began questioning whether Lucio had received a fair trial at all. New evidence suggested that the initial autopsy might have been flawed, that Mariah's death could indeed have been accidental, and that Lucio had been coerced during her interrogation. Experts in false confessions noted that Melissa's mental health history and the intense pressure she was under made her especially vulnerable to making a self-incriminating statement. Just 2 days before her scheduled execution, the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals issued a stay, halting the execution and sending the case back to trial court to review new evidence. Last meal. Because her execution was stayed before the final 24 hours, Melissa Lucio never received a last meal. In Texas, final meals must be requested within a specific time frame, and since the court intervened before this point, no last meal was prepared or served. Her final hours, had they continued uninterrupted, would have looked very different. Last words. There were no last words. There was no walk to the death chamber, no final glance toward family, and no final statement to the world. But in a letter written from death row, Melissa Lucio said this: "I am grateful the court has given me the chance to live and prove my innocence. Mariah is in my heart every single day. Melissa Lucio remains alive, but not free. Her case is still under legal review, and the debate continues. Did Texas come within days of executing an innocent woman, or was the system simply functioning as designed, following a lawful conviction? Either way, her story serves as a powerful contrast, a reminder that not all who are sentenced to die are actually guilty, and not all executions go through without public scrutiny. Texas remains the state with the highest number of executions in modern American history, but very few of those executed have been women. The stories of these women, some hardened, some repentant, all complex, challenge how we think about justice, gender, and the death penalty. Their last meals and final words give us a brief human glimpse into lives that ended behind cold prison walls. If you found this video gripping, make sure to subscribe for more true crime stories from across the U.S. Hit the like button if you believe these stories deserve to be heard, and let us know in the comments, which case stayed with you the most? Do you think justice was served in these executions? Thanks for watching. More haunting true crime investigations are coming soon. Until then, stay safe, stay curious, and keep seeking the truth.